Welcome to the deep dive. Ever catch yourself sizing someone up the moment you meet them?
Happens all the time, right?
Yeah, or maybe you've tried to figure out exactly why a friend acted a certain way.
Uh-huh.
Today, we're diving headfirst into, well, the fascinating world of social psychology. We want to understand how we form those crucial first impressions.
And how we make sense of the behavior we see around us.
Exactly. We've got some really compelling research here that gets to the core of these everyday interactions.
Yeah, the sources are quite insightful.
Our goal, to kind of extract the key principles, without getting bogged down in dense academic language. We want to give you a clearer picture of how we navigate the social landscape.
That's right. I mean, we're constantly bombarded with social information, aren't we?
Totally.
And our minds are incredibly active processing it all, often in ways we don't even realize. The research we've been looking at, it offers some really intriguing answers to those questions we all have. Why people do what they do and how we form our opinions of them.
Okay, so let's jump right in with a question that I think resonates with everyone.
Go for it.
Have you ever instantly formed, like, a strong like or dislike for someone you've just met?
Oh, definitely.
Or maybe you've explained your own success as, down to hard work, but then attributed someone else's similar achievement to just being lucky.
Uh-huh. That's familiar.
Well, it turns out there's a real science behind these quick judgments and the stories we tell ourselves about why things happen.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a really fundamental difference, how we perceive people versus how we perceive objects.
Right.
When we look at a chair, for example, we don't typically wonder about its motivations or intentions.
No, of course not.
But with people, we immediately start making assumptions, guessing what's going on inside their heads, their feelings, their goals, their personality. This inherent tendency, it just shapes how we see and interact with them from the get-go.
So this process, person perception, that's basically forming those initial impressions and then making educated guesses or inferences about what drives people.
Pretty much in social settings, yeah.
And then we have impression formation. That sounds like taking all the little clues we pick up.
Like how someone looks, what they say.
Right, even what other people tell us about them, and piecing it all together to create an overall picture.
Precisely. Think about a first meeting. You're taking in all sorts of information. Their clothes, their tone of voice, body language.
Of all of it.
These observable cues often lead us to, well, jump to conclusions about their underlying personality traits, sometimes within seconds. Impression formation is how our minds synthesize all those initial data points into a sort of cohesive whole.
Now, it feels like some of those initial data points must carry more weight than others, right?
Yes, definitely.
I recall reading about something called trait centrality. What's the key idea there?
Yeah, that's fascinating. Certain traits we observe act almost like central organizing principles in our overall impression of someone.
Okay.
They have an outsized influence on how we perceive the rest of their personality. There's a classic study by Solomon Asch back in 1946 that really brought this to light.
Asch.
Yeah. He gave participants a list of adjectives describing a hypothetical person. Intelligent, skillful, industrious, warm, determined, practical, and cautious.
Right, I remember hearing about this one.
Then for another group, the only change he made was swapping the word warm with cold. Everything else stayed the same.
And the result?
The impact on the overall impression was remarkable, really dramatic. People who read the warm list consistently rated the person as significantly happier, more generous, more sociable, even more humorous.
Wow.
Compared to those who read the cold list.
Yeah.
Just that single word change totally shifted the entire perception.
That's incredible, just one word having such a, ripple effect.
Exactly. But what's even more telling is that Asch did another variation. This time he replaced polite with blunt.
Okay.
And the difference in the resulting impressions was much less pronounced, much smaller.
So warm and cold are somehow more fundamental.
That's what it suggests. They act as these central traits profoundly shaping our view. Whereas polite and blunt, while certainly descriptive, they don't have that same core influence. It suggests some initial pieces of information act as anchors for our entire understanding of a person.
That's a powerful illustration. It really shows how some initial cues can color our entire perception. Makes you wonder what those central traits might be in different contexts today.
Good question.
Now, building on this idea of first encounters, we all know how much emphasis people place on making a good first impression.
Oh yeah, you never get a second chance.
Exactly. Is there a psychological basis for why those initial moments seem so critically important?
Absolutely. That intuition is well supported by research on the primacy effect.
Primacy effect, okay.
In his work, Lutyens demonstrated that information we receive early on in an interaction tends to have a greater impact on our overall impression than information we get later.
So that first snapshot really sticks.
It really seems to.
So that first good impression essentially sets the stage then for how we interpret everything that follows. Is that the idea?
That's one key way to think about it, yeah. Once we form an initial impression, it can act like a schema, a mental framework or set of expectations.
Right.
That influences how we process and interpret subsequent information. So if you initially perceive someone as trustworthy, you might downplay or reinterpret a later ambiguous action in a way that aligns with that initial belief.
Our brains want consistency.
It seems so. We strive for consistency. The other main explanation for the primacy effect is perhaps simpler.
Okay.
We might just pay less attention to later information once we feel we've gathered enough to form a judgment. We kind of reach a cognitive saturation point.
Like, okay, I've got them figured out.
Exactly. We think we know the person and maybe stop actively processing new details as thoroughly. Some research by Drebin, Fisk, and Hasty suggested this.
But is it always about that first impression? I mean, what happens in ongoing relationships or when we have repeated interactions? Surely things can change.
Good point. And that's where the recency effect comes into play.
Recency. So the most recent stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Jones and Goethals highlighted this. It's kind of the opposite of the primacy effect, where the most recent information we receive has the strongest impact.
When does that happen?
It's more likely to occur when there's a significant time gap between our initial encounter and later interactions. That first impression might just weaken over time.
Fades away a bit.
Right. It also tends to be more influential when we're evaluating more transient qualities like someone's current mood. So if someone has generally been, say, reserved, but the last few times you've seen them, they've been really outgoing and engaging, that recent behavior might override your earlier impression for a bit.
So while those first impressions carry weight, our ongoing experiences can indeed update and sometimes even replace those initial views. That makes sense.
Yeah, it's dynamic.
Okay, so we've talked about how we form these initial ideas about people. But what about when we try to understand why they act the way they do? That's where attribution comes in, right?
Exactly. Attribution is the process we go through when we try to identify the causes of people's behavior. Why did they do that?
And it seems like we have a fundamental need to do this.
Absolutely. It stems from our need to understand the social world, make it predictable, and figure out how people might act in the future.
Makes sense. And the foundational work here seems to come from Fritz Heider and his idea of naive psychology. What's the core of that?
Yeah, Heider, back in the 1950s, proposed that in our everyday lives, we basically act like naive scientists.
Okay, like amateurs trying to figure things out.
Kind of. We use our common sense and intuitive reasoning to try and figure out why people do what they do. A really key distinction he emphasized is between, well, two types of causes.
Which are?
Dispositional attributions, where we attribute the cause to something internal to the person, like their personality, traits, abilities.
That's just the way they are.
Exactly. And situational attributions, where we see the cause as something external, like the environment, the circumstances, maybe pressure from others.
So if a colleague is late for a meeting, I might think, they're always so disorganized, that's dispositional.
Right.
But I might also consider maybe there was unexpected traffic, that's situational.
Perfect example.
Yeah.
And Heider argued that our assessment of the external pressures, the situational forces acting on someone, plays a crucial role in which way we lean.
If the situation seems really powerful,
then we're more likely to attribute the behavior to those external forces, yeah.
Okay, that seems like a natural way we try to make sense of things. Now, building on Heider's work, there's the Correspondent Inference Theory by Jones and Davis. What does that add?
Correspondent Inference Theory delves deeper into when we decide if a person's behavior actually corresponds to or reflects a stable underlying disposition or personality trait.
So when can we confidently say their action reflects their true self?
Jones and Davis suggested we pay attention to a few key aspects of the behavior. First was the behavior freely chosen.
Makes sense, if they were forced.
Exactly. If someone was forced or pressured, it tells us less about their true character. Second, what are the non-common effects of the behavior?
Non-common effects, what are those?
These are the unique consequences that resulted from the specific action they chose, compared to the outcomes of other actions they could have chosen but didn't. The fewer unique outcomes associated with their choice, the clearer the link seems to be between their intention and that specific outcome, which might tell us more about their disposition.
So if someone freely chooses to volunteer at a homeless shelter, and the main unique outcome compared to, say, staying home is helping people, that tells me more about potential altruism.
Exactly. Compared to if they chose a mandatory community service option, where maybe the outcomes are just fulfilling a requirement, avoiding punishment, etc.
Got it. What else?
The third factor is social desirability. Is the behavior socially desirable or not?
So does it fit in with norms?
Right. If someone behaves in a way that is socially undesirable or goes against the norm, we're more likely to believe it reflects their true disposition.
Why is that?
Because they're not just trying to fit in or gain approval, they're doing it despite potential social costs.
So someone who expresses an unpopular opinion publicly, we're more likely to see them as genuinely holding that belief.
Precisely. So correspondent inference theory suggests we're most likely to infer a corresponding disposition when a behavior is freely chosen, produces few non-common effects, and is low in social desirability.
Got it. That adds some specifics. Now, what about when we have more information, like not just a single action, but we see how someone acts repeatedly, maybe in different situations?
Right. We often have more data than just one snapshot.
That's where Kelley's covariation model comes in, isn't it?
That's correct.
Yeah.
Harold Kelley's model proposes that when we have multiple observations, we act even more like scientists, actively looking for patterns covariation across different situations, people, and times.
Covariation, meaning things that change together.
Essentially, yes. We attribute a behavior to the factor that is present when the behavior occurs and absent when it doesn't. It's about finding the cause that covaries with the effect.
Okay. And Kelley identified 3 key types of information we use.
Yes, 3 key types: consensus, consistency, and distinctiveness.
Okay, let's break those down. Consensus.
Consensus asks, do other people behave similarly in the same situation? High consensus means yes, lots of people do it. Low consensus means no, hardly anyone else does.
Like if everyone laughs at a joke, that's high consensus.
Exactly. If only one person laughs, low consensus. Then there's consistency.
Consistency. That sounds like how often the person does it.
Right. Does this person behave this way consistently over time and in similar situations? High consistency means they almost always do it in this situation. Low consistency means it's unusual for them.
Okay, and the third one, distinctiveness.
Distinctiveness asks, does this person behave this way only in this specific situation? Or do they act like this across many different situations? High distinctiveness means the behavior is unique to this situation. Low distinctiveness means they do this kind of thing elsewhere too.
So how do we put those 3 pieces of information, consensus, consistency, distinctiveness, together?
The model suggests that specific combinations lead us toward different attributions. For instance, think about this. Low consensus.
Meaning almost no one else does it.
Right. Low distinctiveness.
Meaning they do this kind of thing in other situations too.
And high consistency.
They always do it in this particular situation.
So low consensus, low distinctiveness, high consistency. That pattern strongly points towards an internal attribution. Something about the person.
Because it's just them, they do it elsewhere, and they always do it here.
Makes sense, right? Conversely, if you have high consensus, everyone's doing it. High distinctiveness, they only do it here, and high consistency, they always do it here.
Then it sounds like the situation is causing it.
Exactly. That pattern usually leads to an external attribution, something about the situation itself.
That sounds like a fairly systematic way of analyzing behavior, almost like a mental checklist.
It provides a logical framework, yeah. Though whether we always use all 3 pieces of information that thoroughly is another question.
Right, real life is messy. Now, what about when we're trying to understand specifically why someone succeeds or fails at something, like passing an exam or missing a deadline? Is there a theory for that?
Yes. Bernard Wehner developed an attribution theory specifically focused on achievement on success and failure.
Okay.
He proposed that we typically attribute success and failure to 4 main types of factors: ability, effort, task difficulty, and luck.
Those seem like the usual suspects, yeah. Ability, effort, how hard it was, and just plain luck.
Right. But Wiener went a step further and categorized these attributions along 2 key dimensions.
Which are?
First, locus of control. Is the cause internal within the person or external in the environment?
Okay, internal versus external.
And second, stability. Is the cause relatively stable and enduring, or is it unstable and likely to change?
Stable versus unstable. Got it. So let's place those 4 factors. Ability.
Ability would typically be seen as internal and relatively stable.
Right, you either have it or you don't, mostly.
Generally, yeah.
Yeah.
Effort, on the other hand.
That's internal too, but definitely unstable. You can try harder next time.
Exactly. Task difficulty.
That seems external. It's about the task itself and probably stable. Like a calculus exam is just hard.
Usually, yes. External and stable. And finally, luck.
External, definitely. And very unstable. Totally unpredictable.
Perfect. Internal stable for ability, internal and stable for effort, external stable for task difficulty, external unstable for luck.
That makes a lot of intuitive sense. And how do things like comparing ourselves to others or seeing if someone always succeeds or fails influence these attributions?
Wiener suggested that plays a big role too. If someone performs way better or way worse than most other people in a similar situation.
Like getting the top score or the bottom score?
Right. We're more likely to attribute their outcome to internal factors like high or low ability or maybe extraordinary effort or lack thereof.
Okay.
And if someone consistently achieves a certain level of success or failure over time,
Always gets an A or always struggles.
then we tend to attribute it to stable causes like ability or maybe consistent effort or the persistent difficulty of the task. Inconsistent performance, on the other hand.
Might point towards unstable things like luck or fluctuating effort.
Precisely. A student who always gets high grades is seen as capable, stable, internal. Someone who gets a surprisingly high grade once might be seen as having studied extra hard, unstable, internal, or maybe just getting lucky, unstable, external.
Okay. So while these theories offer these logical frameworks for how we should understand social behavior, it sounds like we don't always operate like perfectly rational thinkers in the real world.
Far from it, often.
We're susceptible to certain biases and errors in our attributions.
Absolutely. While we strive to make sense of the world, our judgments, our attributions are often influenced by systematic errors and biases. We take mental shortcuts that can lead us astray.
Okay, let's talk about some of the big ones. First up is the fundamental attribution error. What makes this error so fundamental?
It's called fundamental because it seems so pervasive. It's our tendency to overestimate the importance of dispositional factors, personality, character, and underestimate the influence of situational factors when explaining other people's behavior.
We jump to conclusions about them.
Exactly, without adequately considering the context they might be in. The classic work by Jones and Harris really highlighted this.
The Castro essay study, right, that's the famous one.
That's a perfect illustration. Participants read essays that were either pro-Castro or anti-Castro.
Okay.
Crucially, some participants were told the writers had chosen their stance freely. Others were told the writers had been assigned their position, instructed what to write.
So they knew the writer might not actually believe it.
They explicitly knew that. But even when participants knew the stance was assigned, they still tended to attribute the opinions expressed in the essay to the writer's actual underlying attitude.
Wow. Even knowing the situation.
Even knowing the situation, they underappreciated the power of that situation being told what to write and overemphasized the writer's presumed internal beliefs. It's like we find it hard to fully subtract the situational influence.
So even when we know there were external constraints, we still tend to think the behavior reflects who the person truly is. That's quite a bias.
It really is.
What about when we're explaining our own actions? Is that a different story? Do we make the same error about ourselves?
That's where it gets even more interesting. That brings us to the actor-observer bias.
Factor-observer.
Darcy, identified by Jones and Nisbet. This is the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to internal dispositional factors, just like the fundamental attribution error BUT.
Yeah.
We tend to attribute our own behavior to external situational factors.
That really resonates if I'm late for an appointment.
It's the traffic. The alarm didn't go off. Something unexpected came up.
Exactly. It was the situation. But if someone else is late meeting me...
Your first thought might be, they're so disorganized. Or they don't respect my time. Internal factors.
Guilty as charged sometimes. Why do we do that?
Well, perspective seems key. When we are the actor in a situation, our attention is focused outward on the environment, the constraints, the things influencing us. We feel the situational pressures.
We see the traffic jam we're stuck in.
Right. But when we observe someone else, they are the focus of our attention. They fill our visual field, and the surrounding context kind of fades into the background.
So we focus on the person, not their situation.
That seems to be part of it.
Yeah.
Also, as actors, we know our own history. We know we aren't always late, or we don't always act that way. We're aware of our own variability across situations.
So we give ourselves situational credit because we know this isn't typical.
Exactly. Whereas we might assume more consistency in others because we lack that detailed history of their behavior across different contexts. We see them act one way, and we might generalize more easily.
That makes a lot of sense. We have a much more nuanced view of our own motivations and the external pressures we face. Okay, another bias area. What about when things go well or poorly for us? Do our biases kick in there too?
Oh, absolutely. That's where the self-serving bias comes into play. Miller and Ross discuss this.
Self-serving sounds like protecting ourselves.
Pretty much. We have a tendency to take credit for our successes.
I nailed that presentation because I'm a great speaker.
Right. Attributing success to our own internal qualities, skill, hard work, that's a self-enhancing bias. But when we experience failures...
I bombed the presentation because the projector wasn't working right.
Exactly. We're more likely to blame external factors, bad luck, task difficulty, faulty equipment. That's a self-protective bias. It's all about maintaining a positive self-image, protecting our self-esteem.
Very human. And this bias can even operate at a group level, can't it? Like how we see our team versus their team.
Yes, precisely. That's the ultimate attribution error proposed by Pettigrew.
Ultimate, okay.
It's essentially the self-serving bias applied to how we perceive our own in-groups versus out-groups.
So our group versus their group.
Right. We tend to attribute positive behaviors by members of our own group, our in-group, to internal factors. Yeah, she succeeded because people from our town are really talented. And we attribute negative behaviors by our in-group members to external factors. Oh, he messed up, but he was under unusual pressure.
Okay, giving our own group the benefit of the doubt.
Exactly. But when we look at members of an outgroup, we often do the reverse.
Oh, so?
Positive behaviors by outgroup members might be attributed to external factors.
Oh,
they got lucky, or the task was easy for them that time. And negative behaviors by outgroup members are more readily attributed to internal, dispositional factors. Well, that's just the kind of people they are.
Wow, that's a powerful bias that could really contribute to, well, prejudice and stereotypes between groups.
It certainly can. It helps maintain favorable views of our own group and less favorable views of others.
It really highlights how these fundamental psychological processes, these ways our minds work, can have significant social consequences.
Definitely.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into how we make sense of the social world. We've covered so much ground here.
We really have.
From those rapid initial judgments, those first impressions.
And the power of central traits like warm or cold.
Right, and the primacy effect. Then moving into our more deliberate attempts to understand the causes of behavior.
With Heider's basic internal-external split, Jones and Davis's Correspondent Inference Theory, Kelley's Covariation model.
And Wiener's focus on success and failure attributions.
Yeah, and then, crucially, the various ways our inherent biases can steer us wrong.
Like the fundamental attribution error, seeing the person, not the situation, in others.
And the actor-observer bias, seeing the situation for ourselves, but the person in others.
Plus the self-serving bias, taking credit and dodging blame.
And how that plays out between groups with the ultimate attribution error.
So, for you, the listener, what's the takeaway here? Hopefully gaining an understanding of these psychological principles offers some, well, valuable perspective on your own daily social interaction.
And the judgments you inevitably make.
Yeah. These are really fundamental processes. They shape how we navigate and interpret the complex social landscape we all inhabit.
Absolutely. And just becoming aware of these underlying mechanisms, I mean, it doesn't magically eliminate our biases, does it?
No, probably not entirely.
But it could certainly make us more mindful, more reflective about the assumptions we make and the interpretations we draw about why people do what they do.
Definitely. So on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider as we wrap up. Think back to the last time you formed a really strong opinion about someone new. Or maybe the last time you tried to explain why you or someone else succeeded or failed at something important. Can you now identify any of these principles or biases potentially at play in your own thinking? Was it a primacy effect? Did you commit the fundamental attribution error? Or maybe engage in a little self-serving bias?
It's interesting to apply it personally.
It really is. And how might a greater awareness of these processes potentially shift how you understand both yourself and others in the future? It's definitely something worth reflecting on.
Food for thought.
Indeed. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.